I want to be clear to folks in this region who are thinking about making that dangerous trek to the United States-Mexico border. Do not come. Do not come.
As VisualPolitik viewers, you're probably well aware that relations between the United States and Latin America have never been easy. They've not always been cordial, and it's not entirely clear which side has been more reluctant to hold hands with the other. Put another way, this relationship has always been less romantic than a Sylvester Stallone movie. Since the beginning of the 20th century, Washington's only interest in its southern neighbours had been almost exclusively to align them with its own geopolitical and ideological interests. This was reinforced during the 1960s with the arrival of communism in Cuba in the midst of the Cold War. Since then, Washington politicians have not hesitated to support any dictators, paramilitary groups, or general evildoers who were willing to bow down to Uncle Sam. Even so, the fact is that the role, or rather the interference, of the United States has gone through different stages. The latest one, that of former President Donald Trump, was perhaps one of the most distant faces of all, and he left statements like this one.
When Venezuela is free, and Cuba is free, and Nicaragua is free, then this will become the first free hemisphere in all of human history. The last hour of socialism in our hemisphere has arrived. The days of socialism are numbered, not just in Venezuela, but in Nicaragua and Cuba. Donald Trump.
However, when it comes to the crunch, how can I say this? Let's just say that Trump never really showed much interest in Latin America. At least not more than a vegan's interest in a £5 steak. But hold on a minute, because now things have changed. There is a new tenant in the White House, a president with a very different ideas and experiences, and one who is expected to try and take on the disputed Latin American competition once again. That's caused us here at VisualPolitik to ask ourselves a few questions, like what changes might the new administration bring? Beyond the Mexican issue, which has its own distinctive quirks, what are the key issues on the table here? And perhaps the most important question of all, what about China? Will Latin America once again become the playing field for a new global contest? To find out, listen up. And, by the way, for those of you who want to know more about Latin America, don't miss Latam Politik, our newsletter dedicated exclusively to this region. I'll leave all the information for you in the description below.
Hit the road.
During the last US presidential election, 2 out of 3 Latinos voted for Joe Biden. However, that is far from the main reason why Latin America is expected to gain more importance in US foreign policy. The truth is that Joe Biden is the tenant of the Oval Office with the most knowledge of the region. To give you an idea, during his time as Barack Obama's vice president alone, Biden visited the region no less than 16 times. Never before has a president or vice president visited Latin America so many times. And it is reasonable to assume that this is not merely anecdotal. If Donald Trump considered the region as something insignificant, a sort of bottomless pit that only gave him headaches, for Biden, this is a scenario in play that he has first-hand knowledge of. And for better or worse, this has been evident from the very beginning. For example, he appointed Juan Sebastian Gonzalez, of Colombian birth, as the new senior director for the Western Hemisphere on the National Security Council. That is, the president's right hand for Latin American affairs. But, of course, the changes were not limited to one appointment. Virtually as soon as they landed at the White House, the new team announced major changes. First, the Biden administration decided to abandon Trump's policy of a second axis of evil, comprising Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua. This basically means that the Venezuelan or Cuban issue will no longer be Washington's only concern. In other words, being part of this common front against this axis of evil will no longer exempt disapproving countries from the possible criticism from the American government. For example, this is what happened as soon as the new Secretary of State's team came to power, when they made public that they were closely following the Guatemalan Congress's attempt to place a judge accused of obstruction of justice on the Constitutional Court, or when they expressed their concern about the violence against human rights activists in Colombia. Secondly, it was announced that Cuba would be removed from the list of state sponsors of terrorism. We will look at this more closely in detail later. And the third decision, quickly taken by the new government, was to agree to grant temporary protected status to more than 300,000 Venezuelan exiles. In other words, all signs indicate that we will see a much more active, demanding, and intrusive administration in Latin American affairs at the local level. But of course, the first 2 issues, the 2 star issues on the Latin American agenda of absolutely every US president for several decades now, are none other than immigration and the war on drugs. So, the first question we can ask ourselves is, what exactly is the Biden administration's position on immigration and drug trafficking? Well, listen up.
A boom of immigration and drug lords.
Donald Trump was one of the most immigration-hostile US presidents in decades, and that is saying something. And that's something that Joe Biden has indicated both actively and passively is going to end. Of course, the consequence of launching such messaging can turn out to be exactly what you don't want.
22nd of March, the saturated southern border, how the first migration crisis of the Biden era came to be. El País.
The impact of the pandemic in already very poor countries, together with the new position of the Biden administration on immigration, and some of the measures taken, such as the suspension of the Remain in Mexico policy, which obliged asylum seekers on the United States border to stay in Mexican territory until they have regularized their situation, will have provoked a new migratory wave.
17th of March 2021, we are on pace to encounter more individuals on the southwest border than we have in the last 20 years. Alejandro Mayorkas, Homeland Security Secretary. They see him as the migrant president, and so many feel they are going to reach the United States. Andrés Manuel López Obrador, President of Mexico.
For example, the decision not to deport unaccompanied minors has caused them to arrive en masse.
The number of unaccompanied minors arriving in the US sets records. Nearly 19,000 unaccompanied migrant children arrived in the United States after crossing the Mexican border during March. This is the highest monthly figure ever recorded in the country. France 24.
And of course, that's when we start hearing messages like these ones.
Don't come, Joe Biden asks migrants. The US president urged undocumented immigrants, who are the protagonists of the latest wave of migration, to stay in their countries. DW.
And I want to emphasize that the goal of our work is to help Guatemalans find hope at home. At the same time, I want to be clear to folks in this region who are thinking about making that dangerous trek to the United States-Mexico border. Do not come. Do not come. The United States will continue to enforce our laws and secure our border.
But the question is, what concrete plans does this new administration have in mind to deal with this problem? And another important question, why are we talking about immigration if this is a video about Biden and Latin America? Well, the reason has to do with the new White House strategy. Let's say that the new approach of the US government is that both immigration and, to a large extent, the proliferation of drug trafficking is essentially related to the local situation in the place of origin. That is, as a consequence of the lack of opportunities, the absence of security, and the lack of strength of local institutions to deal with the problems. And the current US administration understands that it's exactly on these points that they have to work. For example, when we talk about immigration, apart from Mexico, we have to talk about what the United States called the Northern Triangle: Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. These are three of the poorest countries in Latin America. Countries with very, very serious problems. High rates of violence, gangs, massive corruption, and even politicians with direct ties to drug trafficking. For example, there's the case of the president of Honduras himself, Juan Orlando Hernandez, whom we have spoken about several times here on VisualPolitik. Washington's approach is that living conditions improve in these countries, then there will be less irregular immigration, and it will also be easier to control drug trafficking. That is why Biden is betting on resuming the strategy that Barack Obama launched in 2016, the so-called Alliance for Prosperity in the Northern Triangle, a program that received $750 million in 2016, but then, under the Trump administration, that amount was reduced year after year. Even so, the total allocated budget exceeded $2 billion between 2016 and 2020. Money that was supposedly used to finance projects to boost development and improve local living conditions. Well, now Joe Biden has presented a plan to boost this policy again with $4 billion over 4 years. That's $1 billion per year. At the head of this plan, he has placed Vice President Kamala Harris, which is exactly what Obama did with Biden during his presidency.
When I was vice president, I focused on providing the help needed to address these root causes of migration. It helped keep people in their own countries instead of being forced to leave. Our plan worked. Joe Biden.
It seems the problem is that it is not clear that the program really worked. The idea made sense, but the results were poor. During 2019 and 2020, immigration to the United States has skyrocketed again. And, for example, in Guatemala, a country that has received more than $1.6 billion in US aid over the past 10 years, poverty rates have increased, malnutrition is a real problem, and corruption is rampant. Perhaps the problem is that the plan was poorly thought out. For example, it is estimated that the companies that piloted it kept around 50% of the budget for items such as salaries and bureaucratic expenses, which is crazy. That's at least twice as much as I charge here at VisualPolitik.
It's a business. The same performers win contracts over and over again, despite having been poor performers in the past, without showing any level of impact and without changing anything. Carlos Ponce, Professor of Business Management at Columbia University.
We will talk about all of this at length in an upcoming video that we are preparing right now and that we are sure will not leave you indifferent. So, don't forget to subscribe to VisualPolitik if you haven't already done so and help get me paid. Then, in the case of Colombia, which along with Mexico is the epicenter of the narcotics problem, Biden has asked Congress to raise annual aid to fight drug trafficking to $453 million annually, an amount substantially higher than the average of $330 million allocated by Trump during his last 3 budgets. It's a funding policy that fits in with the more interventionist vision that the new White House seems to support in its neighbouring continent. But, of course, that's not all.
Dreams of Caracas and Havana.
The policy towards Cuba is always one of the most controversial and politically costly of any US diplomacy. Don't forget, we only have to look back at the last presidential elections of 2020 when the Cuban minority in Florida turned its back on the current president and overwhelmingly favoured Trump. And they did so because Biden is willing to resume the policy of détente that was once implemented by Barack Obama and came to be known as baseball diplomacy. However, it seems that Biden learned his lesson when Obama reached out to the Castro regime for change and almost got his hand bitten off. So it seems that the position will be rather passive. That is, that it will need to be Havana that makes the first move and actively demonstrate that they are willing to initiate a certain political and economic transition. Still, one thing that the White House certainly does want is to leave the door open. Biden's team is determined to reverse the Trump administration's inclusion of Cuba on the list of terrorist-sponsoring countries in its last days of office. It is also assumed that they will stop the implementation of the Helms-Burton Act, whose Title III allows US citizens to sue international companies that use or benefit from properties confiscated by Fidel Castro's regime. This is a law which has been suspended by all presidents since 1996, but which Trump decided to reactivate in 2019. In addition, given the poor state of the Cuban economy and in order to promote openness, Biden's team intends to lift the existing limits on readmittances and travel to the island. And with respect to Venezuela, it's pretty much the same story. Let them be the ones to make the first move. But, having said that, beyond the increasingly weakened Cuban-Venezuelan bloc, and in addition to the Central American policy, there is another issue of great concern in Washington. Nothing less than the fear of Chinese influence.
The conquest of the East.
If there is one issue that has been causing alarm bells to ring in Washington lately, it is precisely that of China's influence on the rest of the world. It does not matter whether we're talking about the Pacific, Africa, Europe, or Latin America. And the truth is that, in recent years, Chinese influence on this region has been on the rise. China literally devours the region's raw materials and has invested heavily in sectors such as energy, highways, and ports. And that seems to be what Biden now wants to counteract.
Biden's strategy will be to offer alternative financing for critical infrastructure sectors, including key areas such as telecommunications. Benjamin Gedan, director of the Wilson Center's Latin America program.
Just a moment, however, because the most important move to counter China's growing influence in the region and at the same time support the countries closest to the United States would be none other than the return to the TPP, now known as the CPTPP. This is the most advanced Trans-Pacific Free Trade Agreement to which, as we've already covered in other videos, even the United Kingdom has asked to join. And that is exactly what is now being considered in Washington. Rejoining this trade agreement would have 2 direct consequences: a boost to the Pacific Alliance, whose members are part of this agreement, and closer ties between the United States and Latin America. It would also put an end to one of the more characteristic policies of the Trump era: trade protectionism. And there you have it. These are the main issues on Joe Biden's Latin American agenda. And having reached this point, here's a question for you. What do you think the Biden administration will mean for Latin America? What influence will it have? Leave your answer in the comments below. And if you found this video interesting, and of course you did, don't forget to like and subscribe to VisualPolitik. Thanks very much for watching. I'll see you next time.